So traditionally, when a pope is elected, there'll be white smoke, and then a few hours later, one of the cardinals who elected the pope comes out on the balcony to St. Peter's Square, where there's tens or hundreds of thousands of people, and he announces with great joy, "Habemus Papam," which means we have a pope, right? And so I guess I get to be the one today to say "Habemus Parochus," which means we have a pastor, right? So, as many of you know, we've been waiting these past few weeks for the announcement of that pastor, and I told you as soon as I knew that you would know. And so the priest personnel board met this past Wednesday along with the archbishop and chose a new pastor for our parish. And that new pastor's name is Father Bernie Weldeshofer. Some of you might recognize his name. He was the previous pastor up in Lebanon and currently is the pastor out in Wilmington in Waynesville. And so he'll be around about the end of October, mid-October, beginning of November. I'm not a part of those discussions. I don't know when they're going to be kind of moving and all of that. But he's working those details out with Father Kemper right now. And you might see him around a time or two until then, kind of moving his things into the rectory, getting a lay of the land, so to speak. So if you happen to see him, just make sure you say hi and welcome him to our parish. So, I was reading a commentary on our gospel today, and a portion of it, just really struck me. The guy who wrote it said that the word hypocrite, which is a word Jesus uses to begin his criticism of the Pharisees, has a really kind of interesting etymology or history, what the word actually means. Literally, it means one who answers. And it developed into the word used in Greek for an actor, one who responds or one who answers in a dialogue or on a stage. And then finally, it came to represent a person whose entire life is a piece of acting without any sincerity behind it at all. The word itself, hypocrite, when you use it or when it's used against you, it has a tendency of hitting pretty hard, But when you hear it described as someone whose entire life is a piece of acting, that makes it worse, I feel like. That's a tough pill to swallow, I think. And it seems extreme if you think about it. Here are the Pharisees. They're attempting to keep the law, and precisely so to the nth degree, right? And so they see this lack of hand washing at the dinner table, something that every Pharisee would have done, and it's a problem for them, right? Essentially, they're saying to the Lord, who are you to ignore these precepts, these traditions of the elders, right? And Jesus' response is in a nutshell is, that's exactly my question for you. You're accusing me of ignoring made-up Pharisaic precepts, but what you are ignoring are the commandments that come directly from God. There's no law in the Torah that speaks of any requirement for ceremonial hand washing before and after any meal. And this wasn't simply let's wash our hands before we eat like we normally do. This was an elaborate ceremony of hand washing that happened after every single course that they had, right? Multiple times during a single meal. It was an exaggerated form of piety that actually originated with the purification laws at the temple. Because before entering the temple, the Jews would have to ceremoniously wash themselves as an act of purification. In their minds, I guess you could say, in their extra laws they created, they extended this concept of purity further than God actually intended. And in their minds, for them, the entire world, in a sense, was unclean, right? Marketplaces full of Gentiles, hands and dishes that could be contaminated by nearly anything, And so then there was the Torah and its precepts, which are divine precepts on one hand, and then the Pharisees' extension of that Torah on the other, which were in no way binding. But Jesus identifies an even deeper problem. It would have been one thing if they were honestly just trying to abide by these extra regulations, that by doing so they were trying to honor God. And while they're not necessary by any means, God could appreciate that effort, right, of going the extra step. And maybe it wouldn't have been all that bad if the people making the complaint were doing both what the Torah required along with the extra precepts. But the deeper problem was that they were only doing the public and the non-binding precepts, and they were doing them for show, while the lives that they lived in private actually violated the divine law itself. Their lives were a piece of acting without any sincerity behind it at all. And from within that same Pharisee, who no doubt had perfectly cleaned hands, right? From within that Pharisee came evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, licentiousness, envy, all of those things that he lists. And as James said, they're hearers of the word only and not doers. And so Jesus just connects the dot. It's exactly as Isaiah foretold. They honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me, and in vain do they worship me. The Lord doesn't judge by mere appearances, how clean the outside is. He judges the heart, and he can see if the heart is infected with sin or if it's filled with virtue. The question we might ask then is, what is the relationship between those traditions and precepts and with our relationship with God? Because the Pharisees missed the entire point of the law in this relationship with God. Hand washing had nothing to do with it. It had everything to do with their outward appearance, how people would see them, when the real conversion always has to take place in the heart. And in fact, the laws that they had created, they did the opposite of what laws are intended to do. They actually kept people from relationship with God. Violations of purity laws in Judaism resulted in not being able to worship at the temple. They prevented rather than encouraged the relationship with God. But if we aren't careful, we can take Jesus' words to mean there exists no place for traditions or laws. And that would also be a mistake. For example, you will find nowhere in the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, as the Jews called it, you will not find anywhere a step-by-step playbook of how to celebrate a Seder meal for Passover. You find the basics, you find the outline, but you don't find anything more than that. Yet Jesus clearly followed those traditions and many others as a practicing Jew. The church has many traditions and precepts, many of which we're criticized for, and people use this exact gospel as proof. You crazy Catholics, you have all these laws and rules, but look what Jesus says, right? They're just traditions of men. Some of our rules and laws are obviously repetitions of divine commandments. For example, the rule to attend Mass every Sunday is simply a repetition of the 3rd commandment, to honor the Sabbath. That's not my rule. That's not Father Kemper's rule. That's not a made-up rule. That's God's rule, the 3rd one, right? There are other traditions that us as Catholics have that we call tradition with a capital T. These are traditions that come directly from Christ himself, but aren't necessarily found explicitly stated in the Bible. For example, the Bible itself. The reason we have a Bible as we know it today is because the living tradition of the church discerned what books belonged and what books didn't belong, and which of those were the inspired word of God and which were simply the words of men. You won't find a list of Bible books authoritatively listed in any of the 73 books of the Bible. The Bible isn't self-authenticating. Someone had to define it, right? And that someone was the living tradition of the church, inspired by the Holy Spirit. However, the church has other rules, precepts, laws that can't be found in the Bible, nor are they necessarily part of the living tradition of the church. But they're still binding because the Lord gave the church the power to bind and to loose. For example, one of the precepts of the church is to go to confession once a year. Why would the church do that? Because confession strengthens, or in the case of mortal sin, reestablishes our relationship with God. The church's tradition, her laws, her precepts, all of those things aren't random like a lot of people think. They are all ordered towards the flourishing of our relationship with God. They are meant to do precisely that. And that's also why we have problems sometimes, because this reality of what those things are meant to do is rarely communicated clearly. You maybe never heard it said that way before, right? How many of us, either when we were kids or how many of us who have kids, maybe they ask us why we have to do something, why, in the church or otherwise, and we simply say maybe, well, because those are the rules. That's the law, right? If that's all the deeper we go, then no wonder why most of our youth leave the church at their first opportunity. Who wants to base their entire life on a list of rules? Whether it's the 616 or so of the Torah, or however many of them that you can find that the church lists out. Nobody wants to live a life for that. No one ever fell in love with a law. You fall in love with a person. You have a relationship. And then all of the rules and all of those things follow. Think about marriage. Nobody describes their marriage first as a list of rules. Well, I married my wife, so I have to be faithful to her. I have to love her. I have to do this. I have to do that. No, they start by describing the love that they have for this person, how they met them, how they proposed, their first child together. And then from there, the rules naturally follow. I'm in love with this man. I'm in love with this woman. And so, of course, I wouldn't do anything to be unfaithful to them. Of course, I would do this or do that. It's because the relationship came first, and the rules only make sense in relationship with that. So I could give you a list of laws, rules, precepts to follow, all of those things, but none of them mean anything without first a relationship. And that's Christ's point. And that's his reminder for us today. If you put the relationship first, if you seek to know the one whom you call your Lord and your God, if you do that, the rules easily follow, because the rules become acts of love, not simply impersonable demands, not punishment or anything like that. They simply become acts that we do because we're in love.